This case, the Wells Fargo case, is now over 10 years old.
Yep.
It is not simply the case that keeps on giving, it's the case that the phoenix rising from the ashes over and over again.
Yep.
This is Tom Fox. That was my introduction to this week's episode of Compliance Into the Weeds, where Matt and I take a look at the recent OCC basically caving in on enforcement actions against two Wells Fargo's internal executives, dropping them and dropping the fine to a very minuscule amount. We consider what this might mean and or enforcement actions against gatekeepers such as internal auditors, chief compliance officers, and general counsels. It's a fascinating exploration and recap of the massive Wells Fargo fraud from the last decade and the billions of dollars paid by Wells in an enforcement action. This was recorded live during Compliance Week 2025, and the audio is not the best. Compliance Into the Weeds is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. And now, Tom and Matt.
For David Julian, the former chief auditor, and $1.5 million for Paul McClinko, who was his essentially deputy, the executive audit director. Now, those were the charges and the fines handed down in January. Mr. Julian and Mr. McClinko then appealed in federal court, which they are legally allowed to do, and those appeals were pending. And then last week, the new OCC leadership under Donald Trump decided basically to scuttle the case and settle the charges, where the fines for Mr. Julian were cut from $7 million to $100,000, and for Mr. McClinko from $1.5 million to $50,000. There is a third person whose case is still twisting in the breeze here, Claudia Russ Anderson, who was a risk officer for Wells Fargo's community bank. She is still facing a charge of, I know it's multi-million dollars. I'm not sure if it's 7 or 10. That case apparently is still ongoing at the moment. But basically, Trump administration came in, scuttled these charges, and these two men are now paying minimal fines, literally pennies on the dollar, compared to what the Biden administration was ready to impose. We can talk about the wisdom of that, but Tom, also, I was really struck by this case because it gets to what duties and responsibilities and accountability should internal auditors and, frankly, compliance officers, what should they face when they are at companies that are plagued with misconduct? There are strong arguments to make that Mr. Julian and Mr. McClinko really were engaged in dereliction of duty. On the other hand, there's a lot of internal auditors who are pointing out that they should not be held responsible for misconduct at a company when senior management is ultimately responsible for misconduct. And those people have a point. So it's an interesting case to discuss.
Let me just overlay with a couple of other factors. This case, the Wells Fargo case, is now over 10 years old.
Yep.
It is not simply the case that keeps on giving. It's the case that the phoenix rising from the ashes over and over again.
Yep.
We have had multiple podcasts on this. You and I have blogged multiple times on this, tons of lessons learned. So perhaps it's fitting that we would take up this topic 10 years later on what really is the role. Now, I have to confess I don't know the professional obligations of internal auditors as I do the professional obligations of a lawyer. And the professional obligations of a lawyer, you may counsel your client, you may represent your client, but you may not engage in illegal conduct. If you do, you violate your oath and you're subject to criminal prosecution just as anyone else. The Securities and Exchange Commission, in their tripartite formulation of when they would go after a chief compliance officer, one was, as you said, essentially dereliction of duty. Second was gross negligence in not doing their job at all. And three was if they were a part of the overall fraudulent scheme. So maybe we can start with the easiest, which is, did it appear these people were part of the fraudulent scheme?
I would say no, because let's remember the fake accounts scandal was actually done by employees who were under enormous sales quota pressures. So they opened these fake accounts without customer permission to meet their quotas and then would close the accounts later on. That was the actual misconduct that was done by people who were not Mr. Julian or Mr. McClinko. But on the other hand, senior management knew about this. Senior management had been firing thousands of people over a period of years in the early 2010s to try to get rid of it. But at the same time, they weren't really getting rid of it because they didn't get rid of the sales quota system. So who was participating or complicit in what sort of misconduct and fraud? Like, you could define that in a couple of different ways. And at least in some ways, Mr. Julian and Mr. McClinko and several other senior executives were clearly, they were in the room when decisions were made to let this linger and rather than address it head on. And that's really the layer of the onion that we need to peel away at here is, what is the dereliction of duty? When regulators say you should do more testing, or you get an audit report that says sales practices are out of control and being abused, and then you don't do anything, that sounds like dereliction in a very block and tackle way. You're supposed to do some things, you didn't do the things, what else did you expect would happen? I think the trickier question here is that Mr. McClinko, Mr. Julian, and the other risk assurance executives involved, they were also called out for failure to escalate sufficiently or failure to exercise credible oversight, I think it was. But basically, they weren't raising enough hell with senior management that you have to solve this problem. So to what extent were they not doing that because they didn't care? To what extent were they doing it, but management said, we're just not going to do it? So what would you do if you're an audit or compliance officer in that position? And I suspect many listeners out there have been in that position. You bring something to management's attention, you say this is an issue, and management doesn't want to do anything. And that's, if we step away from the facts of the Wells Fargo case to the more broad theoretical issue, that's the issue. And I don't know that we have a good answer for it.
Why on earth then would the OCC bring these types of charges with these types of fine? Are they trying to send a message? Was there a legitimate concern that these individuals had engaged in, if not illegal conduct, certainly civilly questionable conduct?
It certainly looks like that. So one thing that happened, one key document to keep in mind, is that in 2022, at the end of 2022, an administrative law judge who had been investigating this issue and these people, Mr. McClinko, Ms. Anderson, and Mr. Julian, he published a 100-page report, fact-finding report, looking at what they did or did not do to try and address the abusive sales problems and the poor culture at Wells Fargo. That report is not flattering to any of these three people involved here. And it really does make it look like they were not doing some of the basic block and tackle of how to audit and diagnose a problem, how to respond to known audit findings, but also the exact phrase, let me see if I can dig it up, was failure to provide a credible challenge. And again, I don't know what that really looks like a lot. If you are a compliance or audit professional who knows that something is amiss and you don't do anything about it, you don't mention it to the board, that certainly sounds like you're complicit to me. But if you know something is amiss and you tell the board, this is amiss, maybe we should do something about it, and then I guess I've done my job, now I'm out, board, me senior managers, you do it. I don't know if that's failure to provide credible challenge or not. To what extent are you supposed to call senior management out that they're not doing their job? They are the boss, and it would have been very interesting in some parallel world had this case really gone to not trial, because you get to appeal it directly to an appellate court, but I would love to have seen this be aired out in court so we could have a better sense of what does failure to provide credible challenge, what does that really look like? And we don't have that because the new OCC leadership, they caved like a house of cards and just let Mr. McClinko and Mr. Julian walk away with minimal fines. So here we are.
Maybe caved isn't the right word. Maybe they reassessed and determined that their actions met their obligations as internal auditors, and they had no further obligations.
Perhaps, and in that case, it would have been lovely if the OCC had put out a statement to that effect. However, they did not. We just have the bare fact that they settled, and that's it. So we don't really know what the OCC was thinking there. I should point out that the OCC is not the only regulator in town that occasionally will take action against an auditor or a compliance officer. It's rare, and in most cases I've seen, it's deserved. This one I'm a little less clear about, but what was your saying in lawyer land? Bad facts make bad law. Like, these are not good facts for these internal auditors. These are not, or they're not good allegations, I'll put it that way. The judge's report here paints them in a very poor light. From that, you can draw some very difficult conclusions. I met some people who think that Mr. Julian and Mr. McClinko really should have faced severe penalty. I have met others who are aghast at the very notion that an internal auditor might be held accountable for broader failures at an enterprise. I'm not really sure who's right here, but the report does not cast any of these three in a good light. On the other hand, the broader internal audit community is not wrong to worry that this might have set a dangerous precedent, and maybe they're glad OCC backed off. But maybe OCC just backed off because this is the Trump administration, and they back off of every enforcement action around. The Trump administration is not a good protagonist in this story to let us draw good conclusions.
Let me go back to the middle point, because I certainly agree with you on your final point on this administration, but psychologically, what does it do when the regulators bring an action against an internal auditor, a chief compliance officer, where there's no clear rendering that they engaged in illegal conduct? They may have not gone the extra mile. They may have made an egregious mistake. Does that really have, I can't articulate it well enough to say it's going to have a negative effect, but is it going to sow distrust between compliance officer, internal auditors, and their respective regulators?
In theory, yes. In reality here, I would caution us that I'm not really sure the scenario you laid out is accurate. There are a lot of people who would point to this judge's report. There's 100 pages. It goes into exquisite detail, who would say, these people actually, they did not make a careless mistake. They were grossly negligent. They were not involved in opening and closing fake accounts, but involved in saying, we're kind of going to half-ass try and settle this, but clearly we can't get it resolved. There are people who would say that all three of them and others who have settled, senior Wells Fargo executives who have been nailed to the wall by OCC in the past, there are people who would all say, what else should be happening here? They were not doing their jobs. They should be held accountable. On the other hand, it is, like I said, when you get away from just the Wells Fargo and look at the broader issue, it would be terrible to start holding auditors and compliance officers responsible for misconduct beyond their control. I am not sure what we have here with these Wells Fargo executives fits that definition. It looks like they were very much had at least some authority to do some things and then didn't do the things. So I don't know.
I guess retrospectively, I'm not sure this enforcement action closes the chapter, but it seems we're far enough down the road. Can we start maybe assessing what Wells Fargo means or meant for the compliance community, for the banking community, for just culture? And it strikes me that these individuals demonstrated how far down the rot went, that It wasn't just John Stump saying 8 is great, let's do it again at 10, and Kerry Solstead lying to the board. It really permeated a part of the entire culture at Wells.
Yeah, it's more like everybody at Wells seemed to know that the culture was dysfunctional, and the sales practices, such as 8 is great, and for those who don't know, that was the motto at Wells. You had to sell 8 products a day, and if you didn't, you would be very quickly counseled out of the bank, and that's what led people to open the fake accounts. But it was no secret. I think the first regulatory enforcement action against Wells was taken by California banking regulators in 2011, and it persisted for years and years, and then once the fake accounts scandal came to light fully in 2016, scads of other banking misconduct issues came to light after that. I'm pretty sure at this point Wells has violated every banking standard of good practice known to man. I once calculated that they had paid, I think, in the neighborhood of $20 billion in fines or restitution over the last 20 years. But, there were a lot of people who knew the corporate culture was dysfunctional. And some of them at the senior-most levels are responsible for that bad culture. Some of them a rung or two below and I would put internal auditors and compliance officers in those one or two rung below category. Some of them, they clearly do have a duty to say, this culture stinks and we need to change it. But how energetically are you supposed to do that? Are you supposed to run up to the board, shout that we have a bad culture, and the board says, okay, fine, and then just bounce off and you've done your duty and now nobody's going to fix it? Oh, I'll go do something else in my compliance or internal audit job. Is that enough? Or are you supposed to try and take a sledgehammer to the corporate culture on your own? Because you don't own corporate culture as a compliance officer. Senior management is responsible for the culture. You are there to help them make the culture good and better and improve it. And if they don't want to do it, how much hell are you supposed to raise that they are not doing it? And you're supposed to staple your report to their forehead to get their attention? Are you supposed to become a whistleblower? Are you supposed to quit? Because if you do any number of those things, you could very well get fired or get blacklisted, and we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that's a real fear, and a lot of people don't like being unemployed or being blacklisted. So, there are some no-win scenarios.
I was trying to think of a U.S. scandal, banking scandal, the equivalent of Wells Fargo, and the only ones I could think of were catastrophic bank failures. I can't completely characterize TD Bank as an American bank scandal because it is owned by a Canadian bank, but that's the most recent of bankers behaving badly. We had multiple scandals outside the U.S. in the last decade. But is it essentially these companies are too big to manage?
I think so, yes. I think that the bank mergers have gone way out of control, and they should be broken up into smaller banks, or they should never have been allowed to be that big in the first place. You can trace a lot of this back to when we repealed the Glass-Steagall Act in 1998, and when Wells Fargo reached its criminal settlement with the Trump 1.0 administration, I think at the end of 2020, when they paid, I believe, $3 billion in criminal penalties and fines and whatnot. I did a big, long analysis, and you could trace the root of this back to when we erased the boundaries between an investment bank and a consumer bank in 1998, which we should not have done. And that allowed the potential for banks to grow much bigger. So they decided we want to grow much bigger because I'm the CEO and I'll make a killing on stock options if I get much bigger. So I'm going to create these metrics and incentives to become much bigger. And then if my employees don't meet it, I'm going to have to lay on the pressure. And it went from there. That is where this misconduct came from. I would say this is probably the most spectacular, there's the adjective I'll use, the most spectacular banking misconduct example we have. You could maybe say that Lehman, when it went bankrupt in 2008, triggered the global financial crisis. Those bankers behaving stupidly, they didn't understand what they were doing. A lot of Wells people knew exactly what was going on, and they didn't do anything really, or they didn't do enough. And that's the root question here. What was enough for the internal audit and compliance people by extension and risk officers? What is enough that you can do when you know that the culture is rotten? Because you don't own the culture. You're a steward of good culture, but you're there to help management own the culture and rectify the culture. And management didn't want to do that at Wells.
Not sure what more lessons we'll learn from Wells, but I think we may get some more.
We've still got at least that one more case out there that has not been settled. There's probably other issues. Wells is they could make a movie about this. I don't know if they've even written a book about it. Maybe they have. Somebody could. But yes, indeed. Thank you, Tom.
It's great to do a live podcast.
Same here.
This is Tom Fox again. Thanks again for listening to the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds, the only podcast that takes a deep dive, literally going into the weeds of a compliance topic each week. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever great podcasts are listened to. If there's a topic you'd like Matt and I to cover on Compliance Into the Weeds, send me an email. We'd love to take on any topics you might want us to go into the weeds upon or into. You can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Thanks again for listening. Also, if you've been one of my listeners who've enjoyed Adventures in Compliance, we're currently on hiatus producing our next season where I'll look at the 4 novels of Sherlock Holmes, A Study in Scarlet, Valley of Fear, The Sign of 4, and Hound of the Baskervilles.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.